introduce our speaker, I would introduce the president of our student chapter of the American Institute of Architects, who would like to give you a few words. Troy?
I'd like to thank Mr. Sappenfield for the chance to make a couple quick announcements. And first of all, we're going to have a reception after the lecture for Mr. Notter at Butterfield's. And it's open to all the students, and especially chapter members and all the faculty members, so anybody can head on over as soon as the lecture's over. Yes, we would like as many people to come by as possible. And all you have to do is tell them you're for us, and they'll send you back. And I would like to make another quick announcement about Friday night, because the student chapter is going to have a party at the Sunreach Apartments, if you're familiar where that's at. It's right behind Northwest. At 5:30? Okay, it's right behind Northwest Plaza, and we're going to start about 5:30. We're going to have pizza and all kinds of things for Friday night, so if you live in the dorm, you can come up there, you know, for dinner. And we'd like to invite the faculty and anybody else that would like to attend. So.
Thanks very much, Troy. There have been only a few times in the history of the college that we've been able to have the president of the American Institute of Architects, the national president, here meeting with us. So it's a real pleasure tonight that we have George Notter here with us. His firm is Notter, Finegold, Anderson, Notter, Finegold in Boston. It is a firm that devotes more than 50% of its efforts to preservation planning and architectural preservation. Mr. Notter graduated first with a Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard University, summa cum laude. He then graduated from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. His firm has been in existence over 20 years now. He has just finished 11 months of his presidency of the AIA. In the going through the ranks of the AIA from regional director and then vice president and then vice president, president-elect of the AIA, he has set a record for his concern for the public in dealing with the American Institute of Architects. And the theme for his year as president of the AIA has been the architect and its public. And what has happened is that this year, the AIA started a public membership program, which will be a very fantastic effort for both the AIA, but it will have tremendous results with the public and their interest in the efforts of the American Institute of Architects. We're very proud to have speaking here tonight an architect who's president of the AIA, an architect who has won many, many awards for design. I had the opportunity of serving with him on the design committee because earlier as a vice president, he had the design committee and the commission on design as one of his special efforts with the Institute. It's a real pleasure to introduce George Notter to you tonight. George?
Thank you, Charlie. Is that close enough to hear? Okay. I'm going to be, I'm sure, coughing and clearing my throat a little bit. It's sort of the end of the year. Under here is water or bourbon?
There's another one under there.
Oh, okay. It's just water. Someone had asked me at dinner about the year, and I said that it's really been an exciting year for me. I guess you never really know as you spend a long time on committee work and with the board and doing a lot of things with AIA. But the opportunity to be president can, I suppose, go in many different directions. But I started a long time ago it seems to me, a year ago, in going around to chapters and meeting with chapters and architects and committees and talking about architecture with chapters. And really, we talked about last year as being the year of the ear, and a chance to get in touch with the architects around the country. And that has meant more to me than I would have thought. Even though I was committed to doing it, it gave me a perspective, really, on this country that I didn't have before, that both pointed out the similarities of architects and their concerns, and also the differences in terms of what they do in the regions that they're in. And the result of that was probably this focus on American architecture and its public, which is really very simply an awareness program of getting the public to understand more about what we do as architects. As I traveled around, and I don't know how much of this the students particularly relate to or not, but it does seem that all I was hearing from architects was that no one knows what I do. We aren't appreciated. We don't know what's going on. Why don't people hire us more often? And why do they do it themselves? Or this general kind of confusion. And then I think possibly from my own background in preservation, which came a lot from the participatory society, the advocacy planning, the community meetings, I found the public saying, you know, we want to know more about what you do. Why don't you tell us what architects do? Why don't we know more? Why aren't architects more visible? And it seemed to me that we just had two sides that were sort of missing each other. And so the program this year has been to really try to bring the architects and their public together in any number of ways. And as a result, I've been able to spend a great deal of time going around to different places and talk about architecture, even to showing some slides to architects at chapter meetings, which always came as a surprise, that a president would come and want to talk about architecture instead of the current dues or the other things that were going on. And I think that a little architecture has never hurt the architects at these chapter meetings, and some have come to enjoy it, and as a result have invited me to other places. So I'd like to just go over a little bit why I got interested in the public issues and talk a little bit about the public side of architecture and what it meant to me and what I was interested in seeing happen, and then show you some slides about my work and where I've come from, to maybe give you the sense that I'm not making up all of this public stuff, that we really have had an involvement. And at that time, you know, I think we're small enough room. There are people upstairs, I didn't see that. But you can interrupt me. You know, I'd much rather handle a question from the floor while a slide's on the wall than for you to try to remember what you wanted to ask. So I know the slides pretty well, and I just soon handle questions whenever you have something that interests you. I always say that, and sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't, but if you'd like to, it's an open invitation. First, I'd like to describe what we are doing at AIA, because this year is a year of focusing this attention on this evolving relationship between American architecture and its public. And I think the key word there is architecture. We have found that the public really isn't interested in just knowing about architects or just talking about what architects do, but they really relate, I think, because of this awareness that they've gotten of their natural surroundings, which is the built environment, through the preservation movement. And I think the public has learned that they can play a bigger part into what happens. And therefore, I think the public is beginning to demand and get a much greater degree of input into the decisions that are being made about their built environment. And I think slowly, architects are beginning to understand that the public will take that role, whether they want them to or not, and are beginning to appreciate what the public contributes in this dialogue. I've said before, and I'll repeat tonight, that I believe sincerely, in my own view, that in a free society, more and more the basic decisions about how our cities and towns are going to look and even whether or not they're going to work should be made by the people who live in them. I think that the people, the architects and their clients who place the buildings in front of the public for them to take it or leave it, that those times really are going. And we're going to see more and more of a dialogue that will involve the public in what we do. I think, for instance, two of the most significant trends of recent years, that of the emphasis on energy consciousness and the historic preservation movement, are both direct outgrowths of these public needs and wants and this public involvement in terms of the value that they have in this dialogue between the public and all of our design professionals. The issue then, excuse me, is how do we maintain that dialogue to best suit our needs where we can have the greatest input. I think we do that by being able to show people what it is we do. For me, the reason for that is that I think that architects, for the most part, have really worked alone as an artist in a way, and our background as artists have put us in that position. And at most, we've worked with our owners or with a developer or a client, but it has been in a very kind of special relationship. And I think that because of that, the general public really doesn't know what it is that we do. And a lot of funny questions come up, things that might be obvious to us. For instance, they want to know if we're involved in the actual planning and construction of the building, or do we simply go out and draw the sketches, or as they like to say, the blueprints for someone else to build. Do we make a very special contribution to what we do? Or with all of this involvement in standardized construction, designed by computers, prefabricated construction, do they really need to hire an architect at all? Now, I think that we might agree that all architects have skills that are useful in all parts of our building, from our early planning and financing of the project to the final landscaping and interior design. We do not, I think, just draw blueprints. I believe that we plan and we envision, and very often we dream. We select materials, we monitor the construction process, we act as negotiators and managers of the building construction work. We have to be aware of economic goals of a project, of traffic patterns, history of the neighborhood, history of the users, what the users need, how one part of a building relates to another. We have to know how to deal with environmental constraints, with the overriding concern to save energy and the need to make our buildings safe. And with all of this, we have to fit one project with another, and one part of a project with another, and one project into the total surroundings. So I think it's obvious that there's some confusion about what we do when you can name almost anything, and some architect will say, that's what I do. But it's very rare that one architect does all of those things. So there's an opening for anyone else to come in and say, I do something too, and I'm as important as an architect, and sometimes the public only relates to that one person. So the issue is, and I think the message we have to get across, is that when in fact a building is really designed well, when all of these problems are solved and put into one piece of work, then I think the work of the architect is in fact something that suffuses the entire building team. And I think that the result of that work is a structure that adds joy and purpose to the lives of those who use it as well as those who view it. The architect is an artist, of course, but with a difference, because he or she is not just creating something to be looked at and admired, but it's something to work in and to live in for generations to come. I think we also have to be honest and say that this doesn't always happen. All of our buildings are not great buildings. Some are pedestrian, some are cheap, some are wasteful, and some are just plain bad. But it could happen more than it does. And I believe that if we want it to happen, at enough times and enough places to have a meaningful impact on our built environment and the quality of our life, then there must be a closer relationship between architects and the public based on a better understanding of what it is that we do as architects and what it is that the public wants and needs. Every architect should work with a feeling that the public is looking over his or her shoulder. Its presence should heighten our sense in any project of the scale of the building, its texture, the context into which it will fit, the kind of face it will present to the people who pass it by. The architect should be an advocate, not just of community needs today, but of the future, of those who will be using the structure generations from now. And so that's really why we at AIA have set out this year on a quest to show the public what is meant by excellence in design and to explain what it can mean in their lives. By involving the public in the work we do, we intend to show them that architects do make a unique, important contribution to America's potential as a place to live and work. And for that reason, we've offered a public membership to the public in the AIA Foundation in an arm called the Forum for Architecture. That public membership is not unlike the Smithsonian Associates, but over time I hope that that membership will make its own roots in the community with the architects of that community so that there is a one-to-one relationship between the architects of the community and the public of the community. But the AIA program will start with the overview, which will represent a newsletter on a quarterly basis and an architectural quarterly, which is in sort of excerpts from our magazine, Architecture, published quarterly through overruns of the most publicly oriented projects shown in architecture for the preceding 3 months. And those works will be bound together in a very, I think, wonderful small magazine without all the trade advertising, but simply the public oriented projects that you will have found in architecture, but selected for public viewing. So you'll have, I think, a fine magazine on a quarterly basis, interspersed with a quarterly newsletter, making sort of 8 contacts a year. And the newsletter will encourage a dialogue of writing in, of questions, of contact with architects, of responses about things that people might want to know, on a very kind of public-oriented issue. I think that with that appeal, that there can be this collaborative relationship in a much closer way than there ever has been before between architecture and the public. If it has a willingness on our part to invite the public in, and a willingness on the part of the public to want to know what it is we do, and then to tell us what it is we need. A question. The question was, how much would the membership cost? It's set right now at $35 a year, and that includes the 4 issues of the magazine, 4 issues of the newsletter, and of course a warm welcome at our Octagon building, which is the original AIA headquarters and sort of the preservation-oriented building in Washington if you come there. And the newsletter will also talk about things around the country. Yes?
Who are you going to try to attract to this public forum? And what sort of person are you going to, like, advertise to? Are you going to make them come to?
The question was, who are we trying to attract and how do we make it known? Simple terms. We'd like to attract anyone and everyone. We have targeted essentially the preservation community, this advocacy group, as our first public target. And we've identified 4 cities where we have programs where they have different structures to do a test for the public mailing, a direct mail. That's Boston, because they already have a public membership of about 1,000 or 2,000 people in the Boston area that ties to their chapter level already. And that we want to see whether people, if they're happy at the chapter, would even bother to have the national thing, because we wouldn't be disappointed if they don't. My own feeling is that they ought to have it at the chapter, but we don't know. We've identified St. Louis because they have no program, but they're interested in starting one, And so we'll do a public mailing there, and we got a very good response when I went there for a lecture, and it was tied into their museum programs, the relationship to the museums and the people. They had 300 people come out on Super Bowl Sunday to hear me give a slideshow. Now, that impressed me, and it seems that there's some potential there in that area. We've picked Salt Lake City because Salt Lake City is the center. It will be a statewide kind of thing. And there will be people there where there is no chapter to support, to see if people would like to have this mailing at the national level, because there isn't a strong chapter and it would be peripheral. And then Washington, D.C., simply because we're there, right? The Octagon is there, and there people come out the same kinds of programs, and we're doing joint programs all the time. We hope to learn from those four. Since we announced that, we have another 4 or 5 what we call closet programs, because we said we would only have 4, and some people have insisted. And local chapters are making their own mailings to see how they could begin to get started. And we have about another 6 or 8 ready to start next year. So we'll do that as an experiment. We don't know how many will come out. They say on a direct mail you get 0.5%, no matter whether it's good or bad, or that's what happens. I hope it'll be different. To get a bigger base, what we've done is ask our architects, the AIA members all over the country, to give gift memberships to their clients and friends. It would be a different person, I think, the client. They would not be the people who would come to the local things. They would be people that have a relationship with an architect already. We're finding a very enthusiastic response over that. We think that we'll have 2,000 or 3,000 members out of that, and we could easily have 10,000. We've had some firms now, 1 or 2 already, that have given more than 50 memberships for the holiday season. And we're finding of those who are contributing, the average is about 7 or 8 firms, memberships per firm that they're giving. So we don't know where that's going to go. We know architects put things off, but Christmas isn't here yet, and we're just watching what happens. So we're going at it 2 levels. One, just for architects doing it to friends and clients, and the other to do pilot mailings which could expand. And I think that we could certainly have a membership equal to the National Trust, which is one of the kind of joint things, and that's 100 or so thousand. I think there are 140,000 members in the trust. But if you look at the Smithsonian has, I think, 2 million members in the greater Washington area alone. So there is a tremendous variety of what is there. And I think that the time has come where architects are known. We're much better known to the public than we think we are. We're much better respected. I was convinced of that when I saw architects showing up on the cigarette ads. Those people know what matters. And when you have the architect there smoking the cigarette, which I don't approve of, but somebody has decided that the architect means something. And it's time we understood that and we acted that way, and our whole profession, I think, would change. Bruce's theme next year, our next president starting next week, is on value architecture, which is starting architecture and its heritage was Bob Brochure's theme. I never wanted to have a theme. I campaigned on not having a theme. I think that's silly to have themes. It was taking so much of my time explaining why I didn't want a theme that it was easier to have a theme than to explain it. And so I said, well, I just want to, my theme will be architecture. And as a result, they said, what? You know, so we said, well, architecture and its public, which came out of architecture and its heritage. And Bruce now is talking about the value of architecture. And I think when the architecture is understood by our public, its value will be increased. And I think that will make a real difference in our pockets, in our understanding, and our involvement. And I think the kind of work we can do. After all, you might hit on the brilliant idea with your first envelope that people like to think you draw on airplanes, but I've learned that it takes an awful lot of time to explore the kinds of ideas that are necessary to explore before you can really have an excellent solution. And the only thing that we have is time, and that's what we get paid for. And this idea that we can have the quick and easy solution and do great architecture is just not where it is. And it's time that people understood what it takes to get good architecture, and they understand the time and effort that we really put in. It seems like you have to stay up all night and not charge for it to know you're really an architect. But some of us finally get tired, and it's important that we have really more people working on things, and the excitement of ideas that are exchanged. I believe very much that a firm needs to have the same kind of excitement of ideas that you find in your own studios and your charrettes to give it the richness that you have. Otherwise, you just keep plodding along. And you'll see some of our work, but preservation, the frustration to me was that an architect had to do the same thing all the time. You had to be a specialist to get your next job. And you had to lie, I guess, to get the first one, but once you did something, you could keep doing that. One of the reasons that preservation was so exciting to us, because we could be specialists in preservation and we were accepted by the public, then we could do any kind of project because we had cleared the specialization qualification, and then it didn't matter whether it was a school or an office building or a warehouse or an apartment. As long as it was in an old building, they thought we knew what we were doing. And you know, if you look around, most of your awards, a high percentage of the awards go to the first project of that type that an architect's done, because they simply research it, they understand the state of the art at that moment, and they put a lot of energy into understanding it and producing something that comes out that's really quite good. Very hard to sell that to a client. But maybe if they understand us better, that they will go on with that. And if we want to get to slides, I'll go on with this. We must have covered most of these notes that I have. So let's, on that note of specialization and preservation, why don't we start the slides, and I'll show you where I came from and what we've done. And if I just speak up, because I won't be able to see and I won't be looking at out there. This sort of focusing slide is to kind of introduce preservation, and later we'll talk about this particular project. But this was one of the first advertisements that AIA took out, which related to older buildings, and started talking about, this was in the early 70s, talking about what they call the most promising trend in modern architecture. And I'm sure it was set up to go on with Butler Square in Minneapolis and Ghirardelli Square and all of these other projects. But the architects actually didn't want this to happen because they thought it was favoring the architects who did the projects, and they would rather take their chances. I think that was kind of a mistake. This was an idea that AIA had about the value in the early 70s, when there were only about 10% of the architects involved in this work. Now, everyone does some kind of preservation. And I'm convinced that this advertising, if it had gone ahead, would have put more architects into this work at least 5 years sooner than they did. Because they talked about this ad, which I always like. They referred to this as this challenge that every architect liked, how to make a silk purse out of a silk purse. That is, if you take an old building that's already wonderful, even though it might be a little dirty, all you really have to do is clean it up. If you don't mess with it too much, you'll already have your first battle won on the outside. And we'll talk about now maybe some of the inside. Figure out which of these there. This goes back to 1965 when we started in Boston. The bluish dot on the right is an old warehouse on Boston's waterfront, which was just that, a warehouse for spaghetti, built in 1919 to store the spaghetti before it was shipped overseas as one of our first dehydrated things. We looked at this building. In fact, our original partner in the firm, Tim Anderson, was actually this is on the waterfront and in Boston's North End, which is an Italian area. And they were really, Tim and a bunch of friends who were then to become Cambridge 7, were really looking for a place to live. And they kept climbing up into the top floor of this warehouse, looking out in the neighborhood, then running down and trying to see if some houses were for sale. And it was very difficult to get into the neighborhood then. It was very neighborhood. And so their result was to come back and say, well, if we like looking out from this building so much, why don't we do that? And so they went to Ed Loeb, who was then head of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and asked him if this building, which was supposed to be torn down because it was moderately tall, could in fact remain, and whether it could be recycled for apartments. And that's where our work really first started, just out of a happenstance. The studies were made which would really take out all of the glazing and leave the shell of the structure. We looked at codes. This building was designed to hold wet spaghetti or whatever you store, but in fact it didn't matter. The codes required a heavier loading for warehousing than they require for apartments. That you say is obvious, but if you think about it, what it means is your foundations can support more floors of apartments than they can of warehousing by code. And therefore, we could add 2 more floors to this building without messing with the foundations. Very simple deduction, but something that means that you can take a building that already has its structure there and get much more value out of it. And the very early work in preservation was one on how to get more value, from finding space, finding ways to build more space, finding ways to add space, or finding ways to make it just more visible. So we stripped this away. This little grill thing on the left of the slide is actually a train that was still running, in fact ran until about 1975, across in front of this apartment before Boston's waterfront really began to be discovered. So this stripped away, cleaned up on the outside, simple wood dividers to give it more of a frame, and the addition of 2 floors on the top into duplex units gave this really the first new building for people to live in out of this old structure that Boston had had. And this slide a little later shows even the First National Bank there on the bottom, which we restored. That was really a fish market for about 10 years after we finished Prince, until all of these buildings finally changed. And it became a building that really had a wonderful view of the water, that Boston then, and after we had built it, then I lived in one of the apartments there for about 5 years and watched the ships stop coming into the harbor as the maritime thing died down, and the sailboats begin to come out, so that it becomes a totally different harbor today. Now down about 3 wharfs was another old building, and having people really came by and saw us changing this warehouse, and they walked in off the street to say, how do we have a warehouse, could we do something with it? We were waiting for people to come tell us they wanted to buy it and tear it down and build a new building, and no one was doing that in Boston because it cost too much money. And we were able to build these buildings with much really nicer spaces than the standard new building at the time, because we used all the existing spaces for about 2/3 the cost. And so in this building, the only place to add new space and to do anything this being on the National Register was in the attic. And we developed a plan where we cut through that little arched opening a corridor in the middle of the building. And then on one side, with a major water view here on this sketch to the left, we developed a 2-bedroom apartment where we climbed some stairs, snuck over the corridor, and squeezed 2 bedrooms in sort of the top of the attic. And opposite that, in the single floor, we got a series of efficiency units. A typical space of the efficiency looked like this, and then when it finished, was this kind of unit as a single apartment. Now this required a lot of different cajoling and reasoning with the building codes and the building department. It's always been our theory that the building department and the building code is a tool, and it's a tool for judgment on the basis of the code official. And we found that by being absolutely straightforward and discussing what it is with the codes that we are doing and what we're not doing, and showing them what we're not doing, so the code official gets in the position of working with you to make reasonable judgments on life safety rather than trying to find out what you're skipping and enforce it. And together, for instance, the code would not in Boston allow us to have any part of a room less than 7 feet. Well, that meant almost all these slanted walls would have had to have vertical walls out at the top. We would have lost about 30% of our floor area, plus this black pipe, which is a sprinkler pipe that was there, which we use, would not have been able to spray really the wooden part itself, and it would have been more, in our view, of a fire hazard than it is when it's open. That meant, of course, that we were exposing the underside of our roof, so we had an energy problem. But since the roof itself was not in good condition, we simply built a new roof on top with new joists, insulation above the old roof, and a new roof, much cheaper than we could have repaired the roof and put a ceiling below. So simple things that give us a different character, very much common sense, and working with everything you have, every board and every piece, to make really what sort of becomes, we thought, exciting apartments. Next door, the oldest building on Boston's waterfront, a warehouse that was divided into 3 bays that a restaurant wanted to open, the Chart House, the first restaurant on the East Coast. You can see a lot of the cracking in the building. You can see some of the original shutters, a very historic building, which we simply, and with, by the way, a slate roof here that's in pretty good condition. So we couldn't mess with the outside of the roof, and being historic, we didn't. So we restored the outside, stabilized it, replicated the shutters based on the original shutters, where we wanted closed spaces inside, then closed the shutters that we made out of a different wood, and kept the building the same on the outside, but inside really hollowed it out because the code would only let us do 2 floors. And so you see the dark parts are all the existing floors. And where there is no dark beams across there, we've removed them because the restaurant had agreed to let us go up and use the whole volume. And then even to make the attic is really in that mid bay. We're looking into the middle bay of the 3 bays, and you can see the holes that open out into another. The round window on the top looks into an office, which is not a restaurant public use, and that bridge is a second means of egress from that office coming over to what would be the outside space on the building, which is under the roof. Because again, we had no site area at all. We had to put all of our mechanical equipment under the roof with a louver in it, so it wasn't, you weren't able to see it. But inside, it was a carving out process, really just knocking holes in the brick wall, even through the chimney you see on the right. All the brick, it's very workable. It falls out in an arch form like it's supposed to. Used all the same materials, put them back, learned how to match the mortar, but to recess it so that we clean the brick inside by sandblasting, and it all goes back to the same level, so you don't see that patchwork that you see when you take Portland cement mortar and put it in at a flush joint and then clean it, and the lime mortar gets eaten back, and all you see is the mortar that you've added. It looks like you can't match the mortar. But here, by working together, just carved it out, built the floors, used all the same materials, then cleaned it all at once, so it looks like it had been there from the beginning, began to put the furnishing in. Here at the top right corner, you can see we couldn't build up, so we put ledgers, and we actually insulated within the joists and got all of our insulation up there. And still, you have the sense of the joist, but not the openness you saw in the apartments. And then, of course, the people when it's finally finished. And it was, and still is, their highest dollar volume of any restaurant they have on a per square foot basis, which was something that makes it nice for the architecture, but also said something about Boston itself and how it was changing in terms of what people wanted. Now I'm going to jump about 10 years from the 60s to the late 70s, where this project is sort of in the middle of the slide. You see a U that goes off to the left, bright green type roof. So that whole block is the project, and this whole picture is the Charlestown Navy Yard, which was declared surplus. It was put on the National Register, and this The first project to be done was this whole block-long piece in the middle, of which that sideways U is sort of the bottom left anchor, and it goes all the way up to the water. And the idea was to kind of pull that apart to find an area that would be usable. Now we're looking, you see the U now is on the top, the water would be below. They're clearing on the left a whole series of buildings that become a park that the city was doing. And what we will do is right down on the bottom, the two slides that are, two buildings that are kind of in front of, there's sort of a horizontal line there, which was the original. We'll take those away. We'll clear out the buildings in the middle, almost back to the U, where there was an existing cross building, and part of the building on the right. And that in a model, you can picture that same kind of orientation. You see the footings that are left to show the footprint of the buildings in the front, which were added later, back to the original face. Then we clear the buildings out in the middle back to that horizontal one. The U-shaped building got stripped inside and it handled all of the parking. And then a piece of the right building was taken away for the pool, and then a part of it was left. And we develop about 370 units within this area. Now, it's not quite so simple, because inside, these buildings were really all empty. They were big machine shops with two mezzanines on either side of the crane rails. And what we did was simply add floors between every other floor on the side and left the open center as a whole atrium, because it was cheaper to do that. It became the circulation. So we take this, we begin to introduce the floors, you see, in between each area. We used every floor that was there, but built in, and then when they're finished with the tile, even the outside steps go into the side, and the elevators were put on one side to sort of break up the length, but it still is about 700 feet from one end to the other. So it becomes a very dramatic hall, and yet it's interrupted by the elevators. And then on either side are apartments. This happens to be my apartment there in Boston, and looks out at Boston waterfront. It's wonderful when you find a great city that gets lights in it and you move across the river and look back. It's about the best view you have. Instead of in the city, it's like Brooklyn looking at Manhattan, or in Boston the same way. Now this is what it looked like outside. All sorts of different buildings from different times. All of this required our working with the Park Service, because this had to be certified by them as a national historic project and reviewed. If you look at the glass sort of on the left of the building, you can see it divides in each bay to about 6 bays. We argued that that was the major division that was important, and that we could not maintain that whole glass wall and anyway deal with the economics of cooling or heating that space in Boston in the winter. And so we divided the space. So when that's done, this same view, it looks here. You see the same division of 6, but the middle bays have the heating and air conditioning units behind and closets. The building down on the far right, which is where my apartment was, in one of those round buildings, we did keep all of the same openings. We did not change any major opening. We simply fit it in. Looking back this other way, you see the building, you see the park that had been finished, and then the end of the buildings that we had cut back to, and then a marina that's been added. And now what we're doing is doing new townhouses that will be built on the next pier down, that will be actually out over the water, that will be in between the things. It'll be on one of those piers that stick out in front. But you can see the relationship between this project and downtown Boston. And it is, in fact, just very nice, and it's a 25-minute walk to work. It's very comfortable, and it's removed, and yet it's very close. I think an interesting thing. Now, this is the project that you saw represented in that first slide, Boston's Old City Hall. And this, after we had done the early work on the waterfront, then the idea began to move downtown, and Boston had to make a decision between the skyscraper and the building itself. And in this case, the argument was that these old buildings were very important, and there were other sites for skyscrapers, and so you ought to have both. That the building is just as important as the spaces around them in terms of the character and quality of the built environment, the pauses and the balance and the texture require new and old, and buildings that are new as well as old, and I'm not arguing just for old buildings, and the spaces around them. And the issue is how to make them work. In this case, this is the plan inside. You can see a major open stairway in the middle of the square donut and many walls. And even though we lost a major space in the center, when we took out that open stair, it had been changed with elevators and other pieces. But we determined that we could, in that same square inside, you see, get both of our toilets, our stairs, our elevators, all the mechanical services, and even internal circulation. So you had a very high net to gross, as good as any new building at the time. So it became very rentable. We took out all the walls that were in fact not bearing, and we were able to get this kind of rentability and still in a very efficient building, at still working at about 2/3 of the cost of a new building, with exactly the same finishes inside of this office building as another, except in an economy measure, these walls we could not restore because we didn't have the budget to do that. Instead, we took oak floorboards that would allow us to make the curve in here. We simply strapped the walls and covered everything up, so it's there for someone to restore. And the drywall comes along and meets these oak floorboards, which kind of expand and contract around this arch. And you have drywall, and you have suspended ceiling, and carpeted floors, and oak doors, and you have the same finishes of any building, but with 12-foot ceilings in some places. It became immediately the most desired space in Boston, and today commands the same rents in this small 5-story building as any space in any skyscraper, moving from an $8 square foot rent when we did it in '70 to once it was accepted and now is renting in the range of $27 to $35 a square foot. Downstairs, we did a very minimal first restaurant, and once the success was assured, they moved upstairs, where the only room we were able to actually restore, because it had been sort of mothballed for the second phase of the restaurant if the building succeeded, which it did. And using the old doors and old materials, we have one space that shows what the building was like. And so this building, in fact, does become the silk purse of the 1900s, just simply cleaned up again, becomes another silk purse in the 1970s, and becomes really one of the first kind of things that started people looking at the downtown areas in a totally different way. The same is true in this silk purse theory of New London, Connecticut. This is a 1900 picture of the train station in New London, designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, his very last work. In fact, he died while it was under construction in 1887. And this building also had been dirty, and the roof had changed, and it really only required a cleaning of the brick and a reworking of the roof, and it became again a centerpiece of the downtown area. And the inside was really peeling paint, maybe even original paint, unmaintained, where people thought, let's tear it down, we want something new, we deserve better than this. And in fact, the floors, which were not very sound, we simply cleaned the entire building up. We took the floors out. The red door on the left of the slide is grayed. We went down in the basement. We're trenching the basement there. It used to flood about 4 feet in the basement twice a year with the major moon tides and the seasonal thing. We've simply put gravel trenches and some pumps, and when it floods, we just pump it back into the river, and we've had a dry basement ever since. So we gained a whole new floor downstairs that no one would have thought we would have had. While we made the first floor over, we took off all of the wainscoting. We're actually cutting some notches you see in the far thing to allow a mezzanine to be added at that one strip of his windows so that we could get a restaurant in it. So finding space, going down into the basement, means that instead of one building that was underused as a train station, we have 3 levels, a top level of office, a train level here, and a restaurant and a mezzanine, which would be behind us, and this bottom level. And once again, a train station is there, and a building that we were developers for as well as architects, and still own, and still have trouble with tenants and all those other things that have to happen. But an exciting kind of thing. Now, how do you take this and see where it goes with the public? I think You do this with the issue here of a town that when we came had some confusion already, really concerned about their traffic, and in fact really had streets that were just too big. And they had had urban renewal in the 60s. They had actually torn down 90% of the existing fabric in their downtown. And what was left were parking lots. And no one was building on it, and so they stopped. They boarded up what was left, which was a large sort of block area, and called us in to see what could happen. We suggested that they take the money that they had in the Renewal Authority to tear these buildings down, that they sort of leverage it with some public funds to do outside sidewalks and utilities, give the buildings away for $1 to a developer who would agree to restore the outsides and do their own work inside, and use those funds to put it into the public improvements so that the banks thought that it was a very nice neighborhood and that the two things worked together. And as a result, this same block looks like this today, where people have really taken each building, restored the outside, and the city money went to putting the electricity underground, to building the streets and the sidewalks across the street from this. This is the other side. Equally opportunity present in those buildings. As you can tell, we did give up on the porches. We decided not to deal with the porches, but we did keep the buildings, and we did add that the city added these round things in the concrete are actually walkways and stair towers, and those walkways are held free of the buildings and they connect into the second floor. Again, how do you help the developer and how do you make it make sense for a city? Here the city is putting, you say, okay, a bridge and a stair and a walk, but by connecting to the second floor of those buildings, all of which had only one stair in them as a residence originally, and for the new commercial uses would require 2 stairs, this becomes the second means of egress, and therefore they gain 20% rentable area per floor by the city doing this. So the economic, you can see how the economics would change with that kind of input. So it's really common sense from many points of view to let a building really come back to life. And this shows the two pieces together. And to me, the most important thing is that the people have come in and used this space all the time. And it was interesting, there was an argument. We found, for instance, HUD tells you all the time what you have to do, you know, or what you shouldn't do. And we've gone along usually saying, well, you don't care if other people want to do something else as long as we offer what you want as an option, which was one developer for the whole parcel. We argued that it would be better to have individuals on each building. So HUD agreed as long as we advertised it both ways, as long as the whole block went at one time, it could go either way, because they did not want housing to go over the downtown. And it's our feeling that you have to have residential areas in any city to have the mixture that you need for the vitality and quality of life that's important. And so we felt that that would happen naturally. And we tried not to, we didn't ask them what they thought had to happen so they made decisions, just that we agreed that with them that they thought it wouldn't be good and it wouldn't happen, but if it happened, did they care? Well, then they didn't care. And so what happened, of course, was that it did happen. And either someone bought the building to live in it above and rented the store below, or they bought it and had their store and rented out the living up above. And the mixture has meant that every weekend people are into the town for exhibits, for shows, for happenings, and it became really the centerpiece of an area where people had, and then you see the brick spills out, and that was one big open street where all those signs were. In fact, they thought they had a traffic problem. We narrowed it really to 2 lanes, and all we did was channel the cars and gave people less of a chance to hit you as you crossed. And then neither the people worried nor the cars, and they had no traffic problem. They had more spaces for people, and now every building within Newburyport, which is north of Boston up on the New Hampshire border, has now been restored, and not one new building had been built, but now it's starting because there's no choice. And the town did successfully hold its own in terms of the shopping market. Now we're ready to change to the other Didn't this start the other reel, or not? Are you on the same reel, or? Huh? Different projector. Okay. I think we have those upside down. I put them in. All of them. I thought that we would go from the town to Newburyport and look at a planning study that we did that talked about the same issues, and just to show you some of the things in Miami in the Art Deco area. And just showing you some of the things that are there. Can I just go ahead, or? Do you want me to wait a minute, or? Okay. And you know, this is the post office, working post office in Miami Beach. There are really treasures there, and we did a plan which got a PA award, but basically to talk about how it might be saved, which is very difficult, because in fact they've not been saved, and it's very hard without the federal funding to let this kind of plan go ahead. But I wanted to talk about what you do in a plan that I think you have to do to make it effective, and which PA picked up on, which we were pleased to see they did. And that is, a plan needs to make some statements and some decisions. You can't say you've got to do everything. For instance, in this group of buildings, this building on the right looked like something we could save. The building next to it on the left looked like something you'd like to save. But in fact, to make a hotel work today, this hotel on the right isn't big enough. So we opted to say the developer could tear down the building on the left if they would commit to expanding the building on the right to larger mass so that it would be a success. So we made kind of common sense decisions as part of a plan, and we showed how it might be developed in plan form, and even how it might look with a built-up mass on the side. And if enough of those things happened, our feeling was that the rest of the city would have a chance of working, and particularly these kinds of old hotels could be saved, where you can see all these pools that exist in front of them, and to try to feed through this line into new buildings that happen behind it, and that in fact Miami could have another future to it. We're not so sure that that would happen. We wish it would, but that was one part. And the other planning thing I wanted to show you, or to talk about, is that there is a need for some advocacy in terms of what we do. It's one thing to have had some examples which you can all see, but the question is, what do you do about it? And how do you begin to approach this public that I'm now talking about? And I think you do it by making very direct contacts with something that people can relate to. This is not, of course, Time magazine, as you may be able to tell. There is a little up at the very top left, which you probably can't see. It says, "It's Time for Springfield." And this, in fact, although it looks quite a bit similar to one of the formats of Time, is in fact the master plan for Springfield, Massachusetts. And this is the presentation of that plan. And it's not something that we recommend is what you would do all the time, or that even one should do, because Times lawyers have told us we have to tell you that, because they weren't too happy about this. But so you have to find your own kind of gimmick. But the idea of making something that people relate to works very well. And even the city, we did worry, and we had asked the city to give us a hold harmless clause before we proceeded on this, once we decided what we were doing. And they kind of laughed and did. But their attorneys did decide that, in fact, that had been fairly wise. But since the city published it, it was the city that, when people started looking for it on the newsstands, didn't find it, and Time became aware of what was going on. We did have some correspondence. And the problem is, see, it's not just the cover. We did the entire magazine. And it is based, of course, on Springfield, though, and it talks about the economics of Springfield. It even shows the people of Springfield, past and present, and the centerfold is, of course, the master plan. But it gets people involved. And the people that were involved in this planning thing had mortgage bankers, had developers, had the downtown businessmen, had the politicians. This plan, when it was ready to go, had the support of the banks. And they had already committed mortgage money to people who would follow up on the plan. And so within 5 years, we had seen $120 million of projects underway based on this plan because of the involvement of the people and the backing of the different parts. Looks like we're back. We'll see what. Now, going from the planning to a couple of projects in Washington and then one more, because I don't want to keep you awake all night. This is now moving to Washington and a different level and a study of the Russell Senate Office Building. This is a building that one does not do much to except keep intact. And if you all know Washington, or you probably know that the Hart Senate Office Building has been recently completed. And this study was done to look at this building, and another Boston firm looked at the Dirksen building behind it, and the Hart building was built behind that. So there are 3 Senate buildings in a row now. The issue was when the new Hart building was built, and it was designed to take 50 senators, that meant that 50 senators moved out of these 2 buildings. And the issue is what happens when you move out? Well, we know that Congress will simply spread out and fill it up. So there is an opportunity to begin to control that. We hope that that begins soon, but George White, the architect, and then the Hart in line. And you can see with the lines a reorientation in the spaces to be able to connect through them, which you can't do now except underground, and to be able to restructure these buildings. And what we found in those 2 middle gray floors in the top section there and blown up on the right is that one could, and they don't have to, but we felt one could in those certain areas introduce a mezzanine that would not touch any of the existing walls, but in selected areas shown in sort of the white outline in the floor plan on the left. You can see how it makes a little cutout space, and it doesn't touch one room at the end of each of those. It makes a space for an entry, and then one room at the end remains the senator's office. And you're able to, with that mezzanine, instead of having to give the area like 1 senator on one whole wing, you can double the number of senators. We could actually get all of our senators into the top 3 floors, which is where they originally were, with all the senators in the space. And then 2 whole floors left over for support space where the public goes, and it does a great deal to organize it. And if you went further and actually went under the courtyard, you could tie those 2 support floors together with the major support, with light coming down the outside, replacing the courtyard, but getting a very efficient plan. And in fact, if they carried out this plan, you could double the net usable area of this existing building without touching any of the really exciting fabric that's there, and making a very dramatic difference without anything else. As Senator Pell said when we presented this, you know, where were you when we started on the Hart building? He said, well, Senator, we were here, but you didn't call us. So, but you know, there are different ways to do things, and that's not to say that the Hart building isn't necessary, or that another office building won't be necessary in time either, but one can take advantage of what's there, as well as adding the new buildings, and one can even connect them. So the message there deals with the old and preservation, and I talked about preservation and energy as the 2 concerns that I feel come from this public thing. And I'd like to show you now a project that we're the associate architects on, a project designed by a classmate of mine, John Andrews, in Australia, who won an international competition for the world headquarters for Intelsat. And these first drawings are his original competition drawings, and I thought you might like to see that. John designed that. There were, I think, 8 architects from all around the world invited for this competition, and were asked to site this building of 500,000 square feet on this site in Washington on Connecticut Avenue. And John's site solution is really one that goes up this diagonally and can come back down. There's some dotted lines, but back down to the left in an inverted V, leaving the trees that were originally there. Diagram shows he really has placed it in between the major existing trees, terracing up the site using a series of stepped pods, developing a scheme that the dotted things where the red arrows go through are atria in the middle, a very pedestrian building, all 5-floor units that step up, and an all-glass building. And our role as associated architects is we produce the working drawings and made sure that John's design maintained its integrity and stayed there, and then help him with the supervision. A different role for us, another way of getting out of this mold of just preservation now, because we need to convince people we do new buildings at times. But really dealing with common sense and I think citing kinds of things. This showed the courtyards you see in the atrium are all different. More or less water, the introduction of water. It's a very energy efficient building. I'm going to show you it's a glass building with all glass walls that will use 37% less energy than any other building currently under construction in Washington, simply because of the sun shading on the outside and the atria, and the use of the trees for shade, the use of the introduction of air across water and into these courtyards, and a very efficient plan. The atrium is going through the middle, where between the two black things would be one of the atrium, and in it are the elevators, and the stairs are the round things on the outside. The two black dots are the vertical risers, and the black squares are the toilets. And you see there's nothing left over to put in any one of the office bays that you see in sort of these squares that have been cut off at the four corners, where they either connect or go on the outside. That at a larger scale, you see, has 4 columns, but nothing else in the whole inside space. And the gray around them is, I'll show you later, but that's the space between the outside of the slab and the glass wall itself. And this is just a section showing you the stair going up on the left, the vertical shafts that go up and feed the others, and then you're looking at the space inside the atrium. The gray going up on the top is actually the roof space over the center. This isn't through an office space. And this is a diagram in simple form showing you little, on the left, you can see little triangular things. Those are going to be sunshades, and then shading through the top of the solar thing. And the dotted things just shows you how far daylight can penetrate. By having the atrium on the inside, you really have glass on all 4 sides. Daylighting becomes one of the major issues of the energy conservation. These were the competition drawings showing the building stepping up, glass block on the stairs, glass sunscreens with a little triangulation in the facade, and then the large planes of glass of the atrium as it goes up, and a rendering from the more formal entrance at the top. Now I'll show you some construction photographs. These seem to be reversed again. I get these upside down so you know really I am a designer. You see, that's very important that slides both ways. This shows it under construction from stepping up the hill from the right. This would be the same orientation. 3 of the atria covers are on, the one in the middle isn't. You can see the circles of stairs on the side. Down from the street, the trees is an important part, really, of the shielding and shading. And this is the main entry, which hasn't been developed. They're working on the plaza, but to go right up and go through that triangulation, through the atriums, from one to the other, really a very working area. And this is the glass block set on the concrete. The stairs actually go in quadrants through those squares. Would be a period of stairs, a landing, and another stairs. They work around the edge so that the glass block is uninterrupted all the way around as it spirals up on this stepped spiral, if you will. And this is the inside the stair, as one would go down, and basically would be the major way of going from one floor to another. And now back showing you the glass block against the atrium, and beginning to see Now in the left side, it's sort of triangulation, which are the sunscreens that are happening. Because how it's shaded on the outside, if you look on the right hand, you see the facade, the elevation there in the gray zip, a series of triangular space frames that span from slab to slab. On the right, the darkest gray, top and bottom, is the slab. And the little thin line right next to the edge of the slab is a clear glass wall, butt glazed with silicone, mullion-free, that goes across and around the entire building. Is nothing but this glass. Remember, the 4 columns that are holding the whole structure are inside. And there is then nothing but a glass wall. You can step outside that glass wall, and there's about a 2.5-foot space. In other words, the slab is projecting. And attached to the outside edge of that slab are these triangular pieces, and then on those, the gray to the left of that is reflective heat-absorbing glass that is either placed, as this drawing shows, horizontally, or on some elevations, depending on the orientation, it's placed vertically, and in some it's placed both ways, depending on orientation, so that what happens is shown on this mock-up. You can totally shield the sun from the interior glass wall, but the shielding occurs not on a wall where you have to deal with the heat load, because it's outside of the main building. And you can, in fact, then walk along the slab. Here there's a metal grating in this mock-up, but you can walk along there and you can wash the windows, including the sunscreens, because they're open, you see. You can reach out and wash top and bottom without any major kind of cleaning mechanism or other side. And inside, you can see with the shadow that there's essentially no sunlight that comes into the building. It's like putting on sunglasses. Very kind of simple idea, but a major energy kind of issue. And here you see now, in this case, the glass on the horizontal side being put up, and the sparkling effect of it is quite dramatic. And what happens then is a building that is shaded at night. This is now, we're going to look across this and watch it get darker as the building itself begins to go away, and as the light goes, it begins to change, and then the inside lights come on, and it lights up then from a different point of view at night, and becomes, I think, will become a really very exciting kind of building, quite different from what we're used to seeing in Washington. And now in March, that will finish, and we'll have a finished picture. And so finally, going from our city plan to a new building, back to an old building, and this time a restoration, because most of the earlier work was reuse and changed use. Another silk purse, shown in 1900 again. This concert hall, a wooden building that has a concert hall up on that top floor with those high windows, where they wanted to restore it again as a concert hall. It had gone through its neglect. It had become a wrestling arena, and finally roller skating, as these old buildings did. When it was closed down and they put it back, Caruso was singing there. It was acoustically perfect. And our job was to bring it back to that stage without changing the acoustics, and make it safe in terms of fire and other issues. You can see the bays and the piers coming down to the ground. And it too was the soiled purse. Even had opened up the first floor there. You see it's much wider. And it really just needed cleaning. The signs were there. We put back the piers, which are cast iron. They look like granite with both the coating that's on them and the dimpling of it. And so we felt if they could simulate granite with cast iron, we could cast the granite mold and with fiberglass simulate the cast iron, which looks like granite. When it's painted, when it's put back, it really becomes a building that's exciting on the street again. And without your magnet, or hadn't seen the earlier slide, you might have trouble identifying which one is which. The storefronts recall the 19th century storefronts of the period, because there were no existing drawings, but essentially the signage changes. And the interesting thing is that there's really no commercial use in this. And in fact, even before what commercial use there was there, when we simply took the scaffolding off and the outside was put back on their main street, they measured a 10% increase in the gross sales of the buildings on this block, which had been sort of depressed. It had nothing to do with people that were here, because there were no people coming to this building. It had only to do with the feeling of that street. And I think it's the feeling of good architecture, new or old, that makes a difference, and the public can understand that, and it can really matter. Inside, of course, the issue was to restore. On the left, you can see plywood that kind of covers over a baluster. We simply looked underneath and looked at drawings and found that the balusters, the original balusters, were under that plywood. We had to look for the original colors, but that baluster there was there simply for the uncovering and the cleaning up. The issue of finding all the original colors, one little story or anecdote, sometimes you have trouble when you explore the original colors. People have asked me, suppose you find a color you don't like. Well, and I've said, I'd probably just cheat and use something else. But generally, we find that it does work. And we were really quite happy with the color, but our consultants that were doing the investigating and scraping and chipping and finding the original colors that matched, that were part of a thing, then matched them up to this Munsell color code chart. And this came out as, off the chart as chocolate brown is what it was listed. Well, our trustees, somebody read that and said, we don't want chocolate brown in our building. We're not going to paint a wall chocolate brown. And you have trustees, you have your public, and your public decides it's very hard to change. And we said, well, we understood. Well, why didn't we did some studies for different colors, and we painted a whole series of samples, and we said, these are different range of colors, but we found one we think that really is appropriate and that is going to work very well. And we've called it a deep Victorian beige. And they thought that was terrific. And of course, it is the same color. Architecture has many parts, and it has to do with getting into what you want to do. Now, all of these stairs lead to this place, which was a roller rink, and those circles on the floor were to help the roller skaters. And our job was to take this same area, and we did research all of the colors, and then also to add new mechanical equipment to bring air into it. And you can see the balcony baluster that goes around and the nice curve at the end. And all we will have done in the next picture is add one line, which isn't continuous in fact, but reads as continuous, where the air comes out, having been ducted from the attic down the walls, out between those two brackets, and introduced very slowly into the space so that there is no sound from the air, and so that we hoped we did not really upset the acoustics. And then did do new lighting with Don Bliss in New York. And this is the same hall then, with you can see down the one long line of ducts, which then disappear at the end so that we don't interrupt that curve as it changes and comes around. But otherwise, just matching the color to make it to come in. And so the issue was then how to make that space work with the codes. And to do that, because we're on the third floor, we looked at the back of the building and determined we could clear the back of the building to its earlier, simpler form, that is, take a few of the bumps out and go back to the plane, which you can see had the shutters and the other thing, and make that a horizontal egress, and then build, if you will, a porch on the outside, a glass porch, where we could build new stairs, new elevator, new access, and designed, of course, to be looked at night when the building works, so that you could see through to the original rear of the building, and you had a porch which is a holding area. It made a new entry. We tied them through at the bottom, and it set both a combination of new work and old work that made sense by code and gave some drama and excitement to the building. And it really, I think, worked very well to make this building become excitement. In fact, where those people are standing on the top level became the favorite place for people to hold luncheon meetings for all the civic clubs. They all wanted to come there and be catered for lunch. Well, it wasn't designed for anybody to be there. In the daytime, it was designed as a porch. It had no heating or cooling. And in a glass wall facing west at noon is not terrific. But they had this demand for it. Well, then, of course, the trustees wanted to sue us because it wasn't habitable. And we told them it wasn't supposed to be habitable. And so we submitted it as as a passive heating solution where we recirculate the heat into the, and won an energy award for it. So how could they sue an award-winning project? And we convinced them that it was their change of program and they could bloody well afford to put some air conditioning in something that was being used every day. And as a result, the building itself inside now is filled every single day of the year for concerts, often 2 different programs a day for something that was planned to be used 12 times a year when they set out in a program. For me, I think the question really is not the buildings in terms of new or old, but it's really the people that come into these buildings. And whether it's Newburyport in a town or the people in this building, the people that use the spaces and the buildings we work, that come in and then really celebrate the quality of life that I feel only design excellence can really achieve. And that's it. I hope you all do great work. Thank you.
Would there be any questions for Mr. Notter? If not, you have an opportunity at Butterfield's in a very few minutes to give him a question one-on-one. Thanks very much. Thanks, George.